since we are talking about objects that relate to an exhibition, I wanted to start off by showing you some of the wonderful things that we were able to borrow from the Art Institute of Chicago and install with Jonathan's help. So we're hoping that those of you who are local will be able to see the show before it closes in late November. But here's a little taste. So we're going to be looking at a few of the prints from the Nova Reperta series about important inventions around 1588. You can see details blown up like these figures on the doorway throughout the exhibition. And then you'll notice on the right, there's something that doesn't always appear in a research library straight through the doorway there. And it is a model cannon from the Art Institute with a carriage. Those wheels actually roll. And we wanted to show you this particular object because gunpowder was one of the major innovations that were discussed in this print series. So here you have, and then we have a little cameo by one of my sons pointing out that the cannon is also in the frontispiece of the prints. So there are the first 10 of the prints in the series by Johannes Stradanus. And you can see here's the title page. And right front and center, you have a cannon standing in for gunpowder. And pointing at the printing press, we have other things that I'll be talking about today, like the stirrups are here. And here are the three that we're discussing today from the series. So gunpowder, stirrup, and then on the far right is armor polishing. Now, when do we think all of these were actually invented? Were these invented by Europeans during the Renaissance? No, gunpowder and stirrups were from Asia, China, particularly China, starting as early as the 9th century. And this wasn't something that really came up in the dialogue, visual or otherwise, in the period. But looking at it from our standpoint, we hope that people will think about the ways that some of these inventions came to the West and how they were changed a little bit and how they were celebrated with this set of engravings. So Jonathan will be talking a little bit more about the process of producing cannons, a foundry like this one, and the uses of gunpowder. But I'm just going to point out that you see some of the effects of war happening in the background here. You have a very long barreled cannon here and a short mortar, which would be used for different purposes than a longer range cannon. One of the earliest printed books in the show, I'm showing you two openings here, which you couldn't do in the exhibition, is this Italian book by Roberto Volturio on the art of war. And you can see that a later colorist has added the spark to each of these explosives. And then you can see that the cannonball has made a hole in the building. And it started out as a circa 1460s manuscript and may actually have been consulted for his Italian patrons' campaigns. Here's the mortar. You can see that this book by Luis Cortado it was very popular. It was in Italian. It was in Spanish. This particular edition is from 1606, and you can see the trajectory of the cannonball is going from the mortar into what looks to be an eastern site. Those may be minarets. So this one's in the exhibition as well. Probably one of my favorite finds in the collection for the exhibition was this broadside. You can see the full thing on the left. And it doesn't actually have anything to do with gunpowder. I was hoping very much that it was a depiction of a rifle shooting contest, but in discussions with Jonathan and other colleagues, we realized that in this 1567 shooting contest in Augsburg, they were still using crossbows. So even though the technology was available, doesn't mean that it was being used. And it's a wonderful woodcut. It's very large. You can see a lot of detail of the shooting ranges. And in fact, they would have used very similar ranges for shooting with rifles. They did have one technological advantage, though. They had a fancy clock that timed the contestants, so you would know when your time was up. A little bit about the stirrups. I know from social media we have a few people who are here just for the stirrups. You can see the gentleman getting on the horse, using them, one over here holding them, and so forth. We do have a pair in the exhibition. And we also wanted to show what happens if you don't use your stirrups. Unfortunately, this is a book that did not in the end make the cut of the exhibition. It's a beautiful 19th century lithographic reproduction of a late 16th century book in Munich. And there's even silver added to the image. It's basically chronicling all of the wins and defeats of Herzog Wilhelm IV in Munich. This book is in the show. It's very large. It's a so-called Kriegsbuch from 1545, and the gentleman in question is all decked out in his armor, using his stirrups properly. And as you can see, even of course the horse has some protective armor. Jonathan will say much more about the importance of armor polishing. But this is one of the more recent innovations in the exhibition. While armor was made out of metal and polished since antiquity, it was only in the modern era that it was mechanized. And as you can see, there are quite a number of pieces of armor strewn around the workshop. And we decided, you can see in the case a little bit further into the exhibition, that we did not want to have a complete set of armor standing up as if it were being worn. We wanted to show each of the parts separately and looking directly at the print for inspiration. And we were very, very happy that we're able to do this. I don't know if anyone has made this exact comparison in the past, but we wanted people to be able to see in and around some of the sides of the armor. And you can see a little bit through the back here as well. And we have one of the gauntlets are upside down, so you can see that it's significantly rougher on the inside. And Jonathan will talk about the benefit of having a glancing blow rather than a piercing blow on armor, but that was the purpose at the time. So, all right, well, I'll talk, it looks like we're having our own technological difficulties. I don't know if we're ready to have Jonathan jump back on. So I'm gonna come back to the armor for a minute. As we saw in the detail from this this wonderful book of jousting, stirrups are useful for the running or the heading off your opponent with a lance. As you can see from the armor here, there's actually a so-called lance rest on the breastplate. So you wouldn't actually put it there, but you might be able to brace yourself with it a bit. So there's a lot about forward momentum when you're using a stirrup on horseback that you wouldn't be able to manage if you were not if you did not have a stirrup but had just a saddle. All right, I'm going to head right back to gunpowder, and I'll turn this over to Jonathan.
Here we're looking at the first plate that I'll discuss, which is on the invention of gunpowder. But interestingly enough, it's specifically, whoops, that's not what we're looking at. Hold on. There we have it. Okay, now we're looking at the invention of artillery and gunpowder. So in my part of the presentation, I will focus specifically on these two plates that have to do with arms and armor, but specifically looking at it through the eyes of a curator. What do these illustrations tell us as visual documentation of the time? There's not a lot of information from the 16th century about the casting and making specifically of cannon, but also, as we'll talk about, the making of armor. So these illustrations are really important, but there are a number of questions that come up, as unique as the images are. Do they show that Stradanus did indeed see these workshops, or are they from secondhand information? It's a major question that I have in my mind. But there are details that are really interesting and do give us a lot of information. So he must have had some sort of access or tie to these crafts. So first, I want to get into one of the rather interesting details that he shows on this print, and that's this little vignette that's over what seemingly is a cannon foundry. They're casting a cannon in this pit, and we see all sorts of different cannons and forms of ordnance. And then on the way background, we actually see the use of cannons and its destructive power in siege warfare. So Stradanus is really covering all aspects of cannon and gunpowder. But what is this vignette here? It looks like an alchemist in a lab, and we're seeing a mortar and perhaps a bomb going off. Well, that was this figure, this apocryphal figure of Friar Berthold Schwartz, literally Berthold Black, this German monk who was said to have invented gunpowder, an alchemist playing in his lab, mixing the three components that make gunpowder, carbon, saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate and sulfur all together, having accidentally lit it on fire in this plug that he had, and it went off into the air. So it's almost like a proto-mortar, but literally a mortar, because that's where the ingredients were mixed in. And that's probably, of course, where we get the idea of a mortar as a piece of firearms, or rather a cannon. But Berthold Schwartz never existed, most likely, and we know otherwise that actually gunpowder, the earliest recipes of which can date from about 800 AD in China, used already not only as fireworks but also as small hand cannons. And before that, we think it was meant as Taoist medicine. So that's the long lineage of gunpowder. By around the late 1200s or mid 1200s, it made its way to Europe. And the first evidence we have of sort of almost recipe of gunpowder is in 1267 with Roger Bacon in England, sort of suggesting the amalgamation of some of those components that make black powder. But what does happen in Europe is the use of corning, which is essentially wetting the gunpowder. Sometime around the 14th century, they would take the different parts, mix it together, and then wet it, and then put it into balls, and then dry it, and then break up the balls and make them into different size grains. The heavier grains for cannons, the lighter, smaller particle grains, which they use the sieve with, for firearms and hand cannons, or wall guns like this one you see here from about 1480. And what is called corning did is it allowed for the powder to be transportable, and the constituent ingredients, the sulfur, the carbon, the potassium nitrate, wouldn't separate, but also it would allow for the little particles to be packed, but still have oxygen around it. So it increased manyfold the explosive ability of black powder, and that's really the major leap that the West gave to black powder, and especially by the 16th century. And so we get by that time a whole slew of different forms of cannon, and that's really what Stradanus is showing in his print. This is a 16th century image of all different types of cannon, and there were essentially four families of artillery or ordnance. There was the actual cannon, then there was the culverin, and then there was the falcon and the mortar. So here is a mortar, and here is a larger cannon, and then these are what are called culverins. And this smaller one is called a falcon or falconet. Here's a chart based on the writings of an Englishman writing in 1564, Richard Wright. And you are seeing here the different sizes that were available at the time, and these were by no means standard. Standardizations were beginning to come in around the middle of the 16th century, but they were very regional. It wasn't until the late 17th century that they became more standard. So we're seeing here the double cannon, which was the largest of all ordnance. It shot a 40-pound ball, and rather a 20-pound ball and a 40-pound load. And it would take as many as 25 horses to draw the cannon. Culverins were just as heavy, and they shot 15 pounds balls. And so the purpose of all these different forms of ordnance or artillery were pretty precise. That the cannons were used to knock down walls and sieges, rather in closer range, maybe a couple hundred yards. Culverins were for further away, longer range. And then we have campaign pieces or falconets, which were used on the field against cavalry and infantry. Here we're seeing an illustration actually you're seeing an illustration of one of these culverins being pulled by over 20 horses. And this is from Veselieu in the late 16th century. It's actually French. And in our collection, you have here and on display, actually in the Newberry, is this model culverin. And so many times bronze casters would cast model cannons to show to prospective clients so that they could order them in full size, but they were also used sort of as toys. They were also used to play with trajectories. So there were a whole slew of uses for these model cannons. It so happens at the Art Institute, we have at least about 15 of them, if not a few more. And we have about 4 on view, including the mate to the one that's on view in the Newberry. This one is unique in that it has the period carriage that you see here. And here's how it would have been used. This is how a sort of temporary rampart or platform for shooting would have been constructed in a siege, with these baskets full of gravel as a wall against bullets. And here you're seeing a gun crew loading probably something like a culverin or a half culverin. In these guns, the culverins especially, you don't see them much past the 16th century because they were so expensive to produce, they were so incredibly heavy to transport and awkward that they were seen particularly as inefficient, even with the massive amount of charge that they would use to throw the ball. So there's really a 16th century phenomenon to use these massive culverins. And then also we're seeing in this chart here the beginnings of working out trajectory with Niccolo Tartaglia publishing in 1558, the use of something like a protractor at the muzzle of the gun and being able to discover the trajectory and understand where a ball could fall if you raise the height of the cannon. So there's point blank, which shoots straight across at a horizontal, and then there's the trajectories, which could be worked out on a chart. But you have to do it for each individual cannon because each one operates differently. And here we're seeing some of the results of firearms at the time. Of course, in Stradanus's time, some armor could stop musket balls, but no armor was going to stop a cannonball, and that's what you're seeing in this rare breastplate from about 1590. It's actually English. So anyway, moving on, how was cannons produced? So Stradanus is showing us here the melting down of previous cannons that maybe failed in their casting, broken onto the pieces and being used as material. And you're seeing it here in the fire, being melted in the furnace. These might be firewood or it might be something else. It's hard to know exactly what it is back there. But then we're seeing coming out the molten metal being put into a casting pit. So a mold, this is in the lost wax sort of style, a mold was made with clay in a wax model of the cannon or other material, and it was burned out, and you had the basically the long bore. There was a hardened casting material in the center so that that bore would not cast into metal. So you get basically like a pipe. And it was cast from the muzzle or the top of the cannon down, so that the heaviest amount of material would be purposefully at the breech at the end that actually gives fire has the explosive charge of the cannon, so it was strongest and thickest. So you had to cast it into a pit and then dig it out, and then we see workers chiseling and chasing and cleaning up all the clay and everything off and debris off of the cast cannon. We also see a few other activities happening here. One thing to point out is this odd looking mortar. It's actually not a mortar, it's what's called a petard. And here we're seeing a 1620s illustration of a petard attached to a door. The one in Stradanus would have had screws that you're seeing. And then you would blow up a door. Of course, you have to run out of the way, as the phrase goes, so you're not hoisted by your own petard. And that would hopefully explode the door. So that's what we're seeing here. We're also seeing a few other things, such as we see here in this video, the casting of a bell.
Le processus, les morceaux furent ensuite fondus dans un four fabriqué à cet effet, non loin de la cathédrale. A été brisé de manière à récupérer son métal. Les morceaux furent ensuite fondus dans un four fabriqué à cet effet, non loin de la cathédrale. 12 ouvriers travaillaient alors sur le chantier. La fusion effectuée, la cloche fut tirée de son moule après refroidissement et 40 manœuvriers la soulevèrent à l'aide de poulies et de palans jusqu'au haut de la tour de l'usine. 22 ouvriers travaillèrent ensuite à disposer la cloche sur ses aiguilles, et ce travail les a occupés une après-midi durant.
Okay, so that's what we're basically seeing in this part of the image. We also may see here, with this sort of human hamster wheel, the process of cleaning out the bore. And that's using something like an auger or a tool to make the bore as perfectly straight as possible, so that the cannon has a better trajectory and there's no danger of blowing up because of getting stuck or powder getting lodged in a crevice. So that's the artillery. Now, of course, to the armor polishers. This is my favorite plate. In fact, I have an example of this plate behind me on the wall. It's very important to me. I think it says a lot about the armor industry at this time. In fact, the armor industry was scattered all over Europe, but there was a certain recipe for what made the most important centers of armor production. The one Stradanus might have seen maybe was in Milan, although there was a small production of armor in Florence, not quite to the same size as Milan, but also in Brescia. So the two centers in northern Italy, then all over in Germany, in Augsburg, Nuremberg, and various other places you see here. So what is the recipe of an important arms industry? Well, proximity to rivers, in trade routes, a continuous supply of raw materials such as iron ore, and other materials such as charcoal for feeding the furnaces and the forges. And as I said, also major trade hubs to export wares all over Europe. Milan was probably the greatest or the largest exporter of arms in Europe at the time of the Prince. And certainly that was or did require major polishing mills, as we see in Stradanus. Here are two illustrations from the Nuremberg Hausbuche of this brotherhood of monks, but really they were professionals that came into the monastery or the idea of becoming an order later in life. But they're recorded here, thankfully, both armor polishers. The one on the left from the late 15th century, 1483, Hans Pernecker, and he is using a special tool to polish the armor completely by hand. So we're seeing here oil and pumice. and then this sort of stick that holds either a piece of wood, like a very fine-grained wood, like boxwood, or leather. And using the pumice or the heavier abrasives, he strokes back and forth to polish the plates, and he uses different grades. So that's the really difficult, laborious task of polishing armor by hand, which could take just as much time as it does to forge the piece. But here with Hans Schardt from 1572, much closer to Stradanus' time, we're seeing a water-driven mill, very similarly, and polishing a breastplate against one of these massive wheels that were extremely expensive to produce and were a huge investment for this armor-making industry. And you also see, I want to point out, he's got little knee pads to help him use his knees to grind against the wheels. We see that also in Stradanus. This figure here, who seems to be a polisher, is grabbing pieces, but he's also wearing these sort of leather greaves or pads over his knees or calves to help use that part of his body to grind against the wheels. Now, we do have some sources from the period that tell us about these polishing mills. There is the Royal Workshops in Greenwich, England in the 16th century that started as early as 1511. And we see that they were both large quantities of white soap used to dress or temper the wheels. And we see that actually right here, maybe next to the wheels near the benches, as well as oil, which is perhaps what's in this bowl. And then also the use of pumice. And there were two types of wheels. There were the milling wheels, probably the heavier wheels, but also the glazing wheels, which are probably to give the buff polish, the final polish. Yeah. Now, also we're seeing here quantities of armor. Some put together, which would never have come to the polishing mill together or riveted together. It would have been in pieces so that everything could be polished. So there's a little bit of fantasy there. But all of the helmets that you see, certainly by the hundreds, and we know that armor workshops produced these as many as 200 in a 10-month period. Making about 20 a month and distributing them the orders to various different shops to come together and then be hauled over to the polishing mills. A lot of the mills were slightly outside of the armor making centers where they could be in close proximity to the water driven wheels. And you can see the cogs here that would have connected to a wheel driven by the river. Here is a modern armorer's shop who produces for the reenactment community, the gentleman Jeff Lawson. And what's so interesting, it's a similar look to Stradanus's workshop. We've got the windows flooding in with light, but here are the polishing mills of today, all electrical driven, and we can see wheels. The technology hasn't changed that much except for the fact that it is using electricity. And so here is a reproduction made for the Art Institute of Chicago, a reproduction of one of our armors, actually from the late 16th century. And here you can see it in its rough state, its hammered state, and here it is after polishing. And this is how that was being done. Of course, using an angle grinder today speeds up the process dramatically, but in the time it would have been a wheel moving, rushing against and grinding the steel in much the same way. And actually, these sort of patterns you see here on the reproduction are very much what we see on the actual armor. And you can even see on the pieces on loan to the Newberry, there are these horizontal or these striations, these heavy grinding marks that sometimes don't get all the way polished off with successive lighter polishes. So you can see it going from this very gravelly look, rough from the forge, to this heavy grinding to the glazing. That's basically how it was done. However, not all armor was polished in this time. There is, of course, the advantages of polished armor creates a wonderful glancing surface. It also allows it to keep it somewhat cleaner, but you do have to continuously polish it over time, again, using oil and pumice. But here we're seeing a mid-16th century piece from Innsbruck, Austria, that actually stays rough from the forge in blued, which is a heat treatment color, because that was an aesthetic that was also appreciated. But it was extra work for the armorer, because then they had to use finer, what are called plantishing hammers to put a nice fine hammered surface over it. However, the comb, which is this section of the helmet, is still grinded, and you can see the grinding marks, the heavy grinding marks along it, which have not altogether been polished away. So with that, I'm going to turn over to video. I do that correctly.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Suzanne, for your presentations. It's fascinating material. We have a bunch of questions for you both. First, a couple questions related to the armor workshop, and we could always bring up the images if we need to. But Niels Nelson writes, did the technology of engraving images on armor precede or help in the development of engraving metal for prints? I know this is a question you both have been thinking about for years, and I think you even organized a panel specifically on this topic for a conference. So I don't know which one of you wants to begin.
Sure. Am I live? Sorry. Oh, good. So yes, absolutely. In fact, there was one printmaker, Daniel Hopfe, who started off as an armor decorator. And so the use of acid to etch over steel, to basically you put a resist over the steel, either wax or varnish, and then you scratch over it or you paint over it in the areas that are not covered by the wax or varnish. After you apply an acid over it, it will eat away at the steel over a short amount of time, and then you'll be left with an image. And that was actually used for armor for war as much as for tournament and for display. And it didn't compromise the use of the armor all that much, to be honest. So that was done first on swords, at least by the 13th century. We have some examples of that. And then by the late 15th century, it was being employed on armor. And then by the 15 teens, and certainly by the 20s, in the 15 teens, Daniel Hopfe was beginning to not only decorate the armor, but he thought of, as a designer, as a printmaker, maybe I should do this on iron plates and produce prints from this method. So it absolutely comes from armor first. Suzanne, did you have anything you would add to that?
Oh, absolutely. And other artists try to jump on the bandwagon, but I have to say, Albrecht Dürer made some of his worst prints using iron plates because it was just a new technology, and he hadn't had a chance to work with it as much as with copper plates. And there's also the issue of rust. I mean, a number of impressions of prints by Dürer and others have enormous rust stains that became embedded in the plate, and when they were printed later, you get these new inclusions that you wouldn't necessarily if you had another material. So etching ended up evolving away from iron as the material, but it certainly using the acid came from the armor production.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have some other somewhat related questions. From Jennifer Thomas, what sort of symbolic or artistic meanings and representations are given to the, quote, armed men in these representations? So she's interested in the musical tradition of the l'homme d'armée, which hopefully you know a little bit about. She also would like you to speak a little bit more generally about the series. Maybe Suzanne could talk about that. And describe the dating of these engravings.
Suzanne, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, they're not. I mean, we don't have an exact date on them. They're towards the end of the 16th century. We've been saying to 1588 about. Leah is actually really the expert on this, but there's also the first 10 are done initially, and then the second 10 in the series of 20. So it's not all at once. As you saw, the frontispiece only has the first 9 inventions on it. So it's sort of a work in progress that relates to the ideas of a group of intellectuals in Florence that that Stradanus's patron was involved with. And they clearly thought that the gunpowder and the stirrups were supposed to be in the first group, and only came to the armor polishing a little bit later. So it was sort of a work in progress, an evolution. I don't know, maybe they thought of doing more. There certainly were lists at the time of important inventions that went much further than that. And we don't even, and it's also, what did they leave out? Some of the things like paper was not included in this, which doesn't make a lot of sense given how deeply involved the artist was in drawing and printing on paper. And so, Jonathan, do you want to continue? There's sort of another part of the question.
Yeah, so if I can understand it correctly. Well, certainly the print of the armor polishers, I would say, is very much about industry, clearly. And there's certainly an industry of war, particularly in northern Italy in this time. There's no question about that. And I feel like this image is very much celebrating that as a major economic boom in the later 16th century, still in Milan, as it was even more so probably in the middle of the century. But what I see here is it's less about the sort of I think it's a glorification more of an industry rather than the concept of the armored man. I think that concept is very much part and parcel of the period. There's no question about that. But I'm not as sure that this print is celebrating that as much as participation in what is a major economic stimulus to this part of Italy. You see the mass quantity of helmets, these morions, which actually I have one here. These were torn out one a day by an armorer, and it would have taken about a day to polish it. And you can see this is very much the helmet that figure in the center is holding. And this one was produced in Milan around 1570 to 80. So it's almost exactly the time of this print. But orders were placed for these for several hundred to be sent to France, to be sent to anywhere. Funny enough, sometimes they even in the black market sold to their enemies. It's all about economy, I think, for me in this image. But I think other images do the work of the concept of armored men, especially portraiture.
Wonderful. So we are really being flooded with questions here, and I just want to let everybody know that we may not be able to answer them all today, but we will hold on to them and get back to you when we can. A couple interesting questions here about Canon technology, and from Niels Nelson again, is there any evidence from this period of governments keeping military secrets related to these technologies? And then Javier via Facebook asks a similar question. Any clue how Canon technology disseminated across Europe? Were they sold, were the designs sold through, were they stolen recipes? Who transferred them? Were they via monks?
It's a very good question. I would say that there's a lot of literature about the use of cannons in the period. There's a whole genre called Kriegsbücher in Germany, or firework books too. Of course, the Newberry has many of these. But the actual, there are secrets, trade secrets to casting a cannon. So we don't have a lot of information about that. One of the few that we do see is Baranguccio. Does talk about producing cannons, and he actually was rather in trouble for that. He was a member of a guild of or confraternity of Santa Barbara. Saint Barbara was the patron saint of artillerymen and cannon founders, because she was locked up in a tower, and of course cannons destroy towers. It was highly secretive. You did not get entry into, generally speaking, into arsenals. That was very secretive territory. And that was part of the problem too in the 16th century. These forms of ordnance that I was speaking of, these different forms of artillery, although the concepts of the different sizes were generally in a known family type that are all over Europe, the bore sizes fluctuated tremendously. And that was a big problem, because you might have to have cannonballs made specific to that cannon, and you had to transport that with that cannon and have them ready. By the end of the 16th century, that sort of changes a little bit more. Things get a little bit more standardized, but not terribly. And that all is part and parcel of this culture of a lack of interchange on standards, for sure, and the secrecy of it all. Certainly the recipes too of even making the alloys for the cannons would have been regional. And we have only a few instances from the period that discuss a proper good alloy and how you could tell it by scratching the metal and seeing the color of it. How much copper versus other metal is in the bronze alloy. So it was extremely secretive and completely allied to bell casting. The same people who casted bells cast cannon. And that bell casting technology comes down from the Middle Ages and again is very regionalized, but as I would say too, very siloed. So I know that's not a complete answer to the question, but that's sort of beginnings of understanding that, yeah, it is extremely secretive. And that was a problem in the period.
Yeah, and especially with the number of sieges by the Ottoman forces, there was a huge premium on knowledge about, you know, improved weapons. I'm not an expert at all in this, but I did a little bit of reading that suggested there was some fluidity of ideas that you know, both sides were trying to one up each other. Does that seem accurate?
For sure. You know, the best technology in cannon casting was sought out everywhere. Yeah. Also to make it as affordable as possible. You know, cannons were the most expensive equipment you could have on the battlefield by far. It was a huge investment and they had to work and not put the artillerymen in danger. It's very important.
We have some more nitty-gritty questions really about process and about how all of this functioned. So for instance, Deani Taff writes, did any of the pictured well, she asks about how these cannons were used. Were they already being used on ships? Then Megan Pinataro writes about the oil. Which type of oil was being used? And I'll just throw out one more question here that's also pretty specific about process. Did each artillery piece cast require a newly created mold? And how many pieces of artillery could be expected to be brought on campaign with an army?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can answer all of those. The oil is a great question. I'm curious about that as well. Sometimes these inventories just say oil. And so you don't know. To them, it was readily obvious what oil they were using, and to us, not so much. I did recently contribute an essay to the Making and Knowing project in Columbia University on arms and armor in the French, late 16th century French manuscript that project has analyzed. And there is in there recipes from secondhand information or from observation of how to polish sword blades. In there, if I'm not correct, I think they were potentially using linseed oil or other similar oils, vegetable oils or something like that. Not, of course, the kind of oil petroleum products we think of today. And then in combination with pumice in other basically stone grit that's falling apart. And that is all, and it doesn't matter what kind of grit that you're using. You work up to calcium carbonate, which is the finest to give a polish. And you would go from the heavy wheels to a stroke with leather or a piece of wood that takes in the oil and this grit to make that polish. And there was another portion of the question, sorry.
Oh, how many on campaign?
Oh, how many on campaign, and what did you need a different mold for each artillery piece cast?
The mold was only a one-time use. So they would have, you know, tools to produce multiple molds, but no cannon was exactly like the last one in this period. And that's why they could be major works of art too. They could have wonderful imagery like the model one that from the period that's in the installation. You can see wonderful mannerist figures on it, sometimes with victory or many different things, you know, and sometimes sayings, and they were named, they were given personalities sometimes. But how much ordnance to use in a campaign, I don't have numbers in my head. It would definitely matter, you know, based on what was the campaign. I mean, in what one could afford. I don't know. It, you know, it could have been maybe, you know, 10 culverins, 20 cannons. It's hard to say, or even less. But you would have to look into each individual situation, to be honest. Yeah.
Another question about production. Walter Millian asks, did workshops produce whole suits of armor, or was production more specialized? Was the ornamentation of armor yet another specialization? And what does the method distribution of production say about the way Stradanus's prints are organized? That's a great question. And following up on that, we have another question, somewhat related here. Given the cost and long-term value of artillery pieces in the period, do you have any information on contracts that demonstrate a buyer requesting specific artwork as part of commissioning of a piece? So that's somewhat related. Just thinking about ornamentation, these objects as works of art and their connection to the emerging art market of the time.
So that for Canons, I'm sure there are orders for them. I don't know that much about those. To be honest with you, I'm more of an armor scholar than an artillery scholar. They tend to separate, unfortunately, but I do find the subject absolutely fascinating because our collection does have these model cannons. I've done some research into it, but I don't know what kind of contracts still exist out there. But again, these were very secretive things in terms of recipe. They were bell founders, and certainly Venice has a lot of this kind of archival material as well. But the other part of that question was mostly about the industry. And the answer is yes to both aspects of the armor production. There were specialists who made only gauntlets or only helmets. And masters had to prove, depending on what city you're in, every city had different guild legislation or different rules, different confraternities of armorers coming together. For Milan, you might specialize in certain pieces, and certain workshops might specialize in those pieces. And as a master, you might only graduate to say, I make gauntlets or I make helmets. And you show that object to prove that you have that capability. It's judged by the guild. You pass that, and then you can only make those. There are some masters that submit the entire armor. Head to toe or head to torso. And they're allowed as a workshop to produce all of it. Now, some communities in like Augsburg or even Cologne in Germany, you had to produce a full armor to become a master, or basically certain core pieces like the breastplate, the helmet, the gorget for the neck, or parts of the arms to be considered a master. And you might submit gauntlets later so that you can also make gauntlets for your workshop. What this created was a sort of interesting system of dependency on different workshops to make different parts. And follow models. And so some contracts for, say, morions, like this one from the 1560s says, please, as I mentioned before, make, the contract is to make 200 and 20 a month for 10 months, and they have to follow the example that's in this workshop. So there were sort of parts of contracts that were very much like that in distributing the work. Now, what Stradanus's print shows us is one aspect of this that is almost always separate, and that is the armor polishers were almost always separate from the armorers themselves. It's not that the armorers did do a little bit of polishing themselves while in the process, but the lion's share of polishing would have been done at a mill, either water driven, or I forgot to mention, also driven by horses. So the mill that was at Greenwich, outside of London, of course, in England, they had a horse going around and around and around in a circle to run their polishing mill. Or they sent it out to another mill. So these are the sorts of things that had to happen. But, that was a huge expense. And in some cases, the Guild of Armorers, like in Cologne, or the Handicraft in Cologne, this is work published by Pierre Tejanian for the Met, they would try to subsidize or come together to pay for a new mill outside of the city of Cologne. And that was a huge expense, but very important to their trade. And they all had rights to use that mill and use the designated polishers.
Just building off of what you've just been talking about, we have a couple of new questions about essentially related to these workmen. Celine Camp writes, wants to know more about their training, their education, were they metal workers with skills in the making of armor? And then Brandon had actually asked previously, he wanted to know more about payment. Were they part of a guild system? I think this will probably be our last question. So just to give us more background about these workmen that we see in the engravings.
Yeah, so the payment for the Millmen, you know, more documentation needs to be exposed. And there has not, to my knowledge, been a study solely on armor polishers, and it would be wonderful if that did exist. And some of my colleagues might even know more about these documents. But certainly, I don't know if they were paid piecemeal or paid in bulk. Certainly, finer armors, I mean, we've been talking mostly about what we term munitions grade armor. This is the armor for the more common soldiers in the time, rather than the finest of armor that would have produced from noblemen for use in tournaments or parades. Those too would be polished on mills, but they would have gotten special attention and probably been more contracted. And the relationship between polisher and armor was probably very tight, but also under stress. You had to trust your polisher because they could break through in the process. They had to know how far to take it. And also the polisher was reliant on the armorer to hammer the surface as neatly as possible, so they didn't have to spend hours grinding out some area that was too big or too lumpy. So there was very much, there must have been a lot of communication back and forth, for sure, even though they were separate trades. But you know, what they were paid and how they were organized, there's much work that needs to be done. Was there another part of the question?
Well, actually, Jonathan, it actually sounds like the back and forth in producing the prints in the series, whereas you have the ideas, the images which were drawn, and then they went to the engravers, and then were proofed and back and forth. And it does sound again like a collaborative process, much in the way almost all the trades are shown in the series.
And knowledge about these processes, like you said, aren't documented that well in this period, which is frustrating for us historians and art historians.
That's why the image is so important to us. Mm-hmm. And it's been used, the armor polisher's image, which is like right here behind me, has been used by so many historians as the image for polishing, other than the Nuremberg house book that I just showed. There's really nothing more to suggest what is going on here. And then there are these stray contracts, like, as I said, in Greenwich and then in Cologne. And I'm sure in a lot of city archives, maybe even Milan, and more recently I was trying to look at what has been published out of the armorer's documents in Milan, and I didn't see much reference to polishers, although I know they existed. And there was a small workshop in Florence, and that's why I wondered, you know, did Stradanus see this in Florence, or did he see it in Milan? I don't know. But Florence was a very small workshop. There were Milanese armorers who moved to Florence during the reign of Francesco de' Medici, and were producing armors for the guards there. We know of some in the Bargello, but they must have had a polishing mill too. And maybe it was ran by the Arno. I don't know. I'm sure there might be archives that tell us about these things further off, but it's work to be done. It sounds like a dissertation for somebody.
That's a good way to end here our conversation. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Suzanne, for presenting this wonderful discussion of armor polishing in relationship to Stradanus's engravings, and our exhibition on view at the Newberry right now. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. A recording of the program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in the next couple days. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community, so please make a gift to the Newberry today by visiting newberry.org/give. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to the Newberry as soon as it is safe to do so. And in the meantime, please join us for our next virtual program, which is on September 29th, Tuesday, 4 o'clock, and it's entitled The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity, from Nixon to Trump. So we hope to see you there and look forward to seeing you at the exhibition, which is open Tuesday through Friday, noon to 4. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Leah.